is. What separates healthy beliefs and belief systems from unhealthy ones is essentially belief systems that you say, and now everybody else must believe this too. That's where it becomes unhealthy. If you have a belief system, you say, this is the belief system that works well for me, and my wife has a different one, and that works well for her, and my kids have that one, and it works well for them. That is actually a really healthy way to engage different beliefs. Now, if you want to have debates and discussions about them and the validity and the value of them, that of course is wonderful and beautiful. But at the end of the day, if you say, well, I'm going to cut off my relationships because these people don't reflect my beliefs, that can be a little bit problematic or psychologically unhealthy, of course. Yeah, these are our capacity for belief and creativity. So objectivity is kind of about knowing facts and understanding them. Belief and creativity are kind of how we engage with the unknown. Belief is where I think about what do I think about the unknown, if that's what belief is, and then creativity is, and how do I start to engage the unknown? And so any number of ways to do that, of course, traditionally artistic ways, but there are people who are architects. There are people who can be creative in the way that they, I don't know, clean teeth as a dentist. There's not like a right or wrong way to engage the unknown, but we're all kind of doing it on some level. A couple examples of this. A painting by Van Gogh, for instance. If you were to look at a painting by Vincent van Gogh, you're not going to learn any objective truths about existence, but you are going to have an experience of the subjective tragedy and beauty that life has to offer. Or another kind of more maybe at home or closer in example, the experience of eating ice cream. Is anybody in here particularly familiar with nutrition, health, that type of thing? Okay. And so, people who are familiar with health might say, there is maybe no objective reason to ever eat ice cream. I don't know that it offers much in the way of health or value. And yet, if I was to poll how many people in here actually enjoy ice cream, most people are nodding their heads. The subjective experience of ice cream is delightful. And so we ignore the objectivity. We say those numbers, that data, that doesn't matter to me. I'm going to pump my body full of this stuff because it feels amazing. And so again, subjectivity in counseling is kind of this experience. If objectivity is how we achieve stability and how we quantify symptoms as well as their reduction, objectivity kind of is where this more preventative side of counseling comes in. One of the reasons why it's challenging that we've moved so far away from subjectivity in our culture is because when we move away from subjectivity, oftentimes we don't realize we kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater because some very, very subjective experiences in life are fulfillment and passion, enthusiasm, joy. These types of things are not going to be achievable through objectivity. And so I have plenty of clients who look at their lives and they say, I've got great salary, I've got great benefits, and I am subjectively miserable. And that's kind of where we really start to engage this belief in creativity. Well, what's going on? How do you relate to the unknown? And sometimes we've just kind of left that so far behind. We've left a lot of the enjoyment of life with it. We've just kind of a couple other components of this. We'll go through these real quick, and then we can get to the Q&A. Rapport building and hopefulness. These account for about 80 to 90% of success in counseling. As wonderful as my evidence-based practices are, intervention is about 5% of the impact at the end of the day. If you are a clinician and you can build rapport and you can help generate hopefulness with your clients, you've already accomplished a massive amount of the work. The reason for that is obvious. If you were to meet me as your counselor and you were to say, he's a weirdo and I don't trust him, we're not going to probably accomplish a lot in counseling. And so I tell all my clients the first time I meet them, if I am not a good fit for you, find a clinician who is, because this accounts, of course, for a massive part of counseling success. And then this ability to generate hopefulness. That is, at the end of the day, the placebo effect, this belief that I am getting better. It has a huge impact. And again, this is just a wonderful part of the human brain. If it believes it is getting better, you have significantly increased the odds that it will get better. We don't really understand that. The placebo effect is still kind of a mystery to scientists. I like to chalk it up to our power of subjectivity and the power of belief at the end of the day. But that's kind of all I have today. Now we can move into the questions and answers section. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them, like I said. And thank you all so much for coming out. This was really enjoyable for me. So thank you. Thank you.
Testing. Oh, yep, it's on.
Is the mammalian brain what causes the chameleon effect?
The chameleon effect?
Yeah, where you will naturally change the way you talk, the way you present yourself, the accent, certain words you use to fit in with specific groups of people who are around you.
Yeah, yep, absolutely. It's kind of that. It's a really. I'm gonna probably steal that from you and use that. This is the chameleon effect. No, you're absolutely right. Yeah. It's like looking at your social situation and saying, oh, these people have a certain expectation for how I act, how I behave, the way I, interact. And so, yeah, that's a really good example. Thank you.
I also have one more question. Can there be like factors of emotions that like a young child they're still mostly with the reptilian brain, can there be factors that cause them to develop other parts of the brain earlier and cause them to have brains that are like kind of differently developed emotionally?
Yeah, absolutely. The ways that our brains develop are very diverse, for lack of a better term. And so these are kind of general principles, but absolutely, there are elements of if you need to grow up much faster than maybe would be ideal, you can, the way in which your brain develops can be, well, to begin with, it's not like it's as linear as that's made out to be. I mean, everybody ages 0 to 10 still has this human element of the brain, has this mammalian element. It's just kind of about this kind of expansion of development, if that makes sense. And so, well, adolescents, maybe their kind of logic and reasoning and in human parts of their brain are still going to undergo a lot of changes. That doesn't mean there isn't any logic or reasoning available to them, if that makes sense. And I guess to answer your question, depending on the experiences that you have, yes, certain areas can develop faster or undergo more maybe manipulations by environment before other areas. That's really what, there was another slide, this whole field of epigenetics is where we're studying the interaction of genes and environment. And so, yes, environment can definitely impact the way that our brains develop over time.
Yeah, my question has to do with trauma or wounding. Do you think that when that happens in your life gets you stuck in a certain part of that brain?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I'm so glad I have this question because that was a part of the presentation that I didn't even talk about that I wanted to. Trauma and wounding really heavily impacts that reptilian brain. Again, typically what a traumatic experience can be defined by is my sense of safety or security was very, very highly threatened. So what usually happens is the reptile brain says, well, I'm going to hang on to this, and I'm going to make sure that if anything similar to this, these could be called triggers, happens again, I'm going to escalate this body, and I'm going to get it away from this, or I'm going to keep the body safe. And so yes, that can definitely have this impact of maybe stifling growth or getting us stuck in places, because when trauma is existing just in that reptilian brain, that very, very quickly kind of takes the driver's seat. And so the reason that we talk so much in therapy and we use language and we try to get people to talk about their trauma, hopefully very gently and gradually, is because when we use language, we get to kind of migrate the trauma away from that reptilian brain up to the human brain. And that's where it can now, oftentimes for the first time, we can apply logic and reasoning and time to it, or context. And so that's really how we can kind of put it behind us. As long as it exists in that trauma or that reptilian part of the brain, it's really, really hard for our brain to apply time and logic and reasoning to it. So oftentimes, if you experience severe trauma, you can have this experience of, I'm right back there, or I'm never going to move on from this, or this is going to be the rest of my life. And that's because it really just kind of exists outside of time at that point for most people. And then there's, of course, this other response oftentimes, because it's so uncomfortable, of, I'm just going to ignore this. I'm going to shove it down. I'm going to repress it. Keep it there. And essentially what that is like, let the alligator hang on to it. But as long as that happens, it typically tends to grow. And so I talk with a lot of clients about the interaction of anxiety and avoidance, and exposure and habituation. And so I've talked with Dr. Richard and Stacy maybe about doing a whole presentation on anxiety, because the impacts of it are very, very far-reaching, beyond just kind of physical avoidance. Psychological avoidance also tends to increase the anxiety we experience around, talking about trauma or or having hard conversations, any of those things. So, yeah.
I've had some serious trauma in my life, and it was suggested that I get therapy, and I forgot. I blacked out huge pieces of my childhood, and I don't want to remember those pieces because I know they were bad.
Yeah.
I have since gotten really brave and done therapy, but there's still places that I don't remember. So that I do wonder about, especially when you're talking about the reptilian brain thing and holding on to that, does that sort of stop your flow? You know what I mean? I don't know if you have to keep going to therapy, you have to keep working to work through that. Do you have to look at those things?
Yeah, I don't know that there's a have to. My guess is, it sounds like as you went through some of the work, some of the things that you thought had been blacked out kind of came back a little bit. Okay. And so the brain does have this element of being like, oh, I have been repressing this. Here are memories that I thought I'd had shut down. And if there are elements of it that are still blacked out, I've worked with plenty of clients who never have a full recollection of what their trauma is. But just the ability to talk about even the lack of the memory and say, this is kind of contributing to a sense of self-doubt, or this is contributing to a feeling of insecurity or unsafety in this particular area. It's not so much that there's a need to really relive the experience in order to move past it, but being able to talk about it and even say, I think this was something that was really awful that happened to me. I don't have a lot of details, but here are some of the things that happened. Here was the outcomes of the things that happened. Again, even if the actual seed of the trauma is not necessarily discoverable, oftentimes if your brain can kind of talk around the thing that happened and explore, okay, well, here are all the different outcomes and things that contributed to it, it becomes, again, that logic and time part of the brain can say, oh, okay, well, are there elements of this that are holding me back or that are keeping me from moving forward? How can I address those? Or are there elements of this that I can look at, because on the more strengths-based side of things, and I can look at and say, wow, I'm really, really strong and resilient to have come through this, and I can use that identification to move me forward in life and to take a lot of pride in myself and who I am and in my resilience and what I've overcome. And so it doesn't necessarily need to be this identification of every single thing. I think that would be unrealistic at the end of the day. Most of us can only remember, very small snippets of our early childhoods. But in the exploration, oftentimes we can see, oh, the broader learning of this time has served to really kind of stick me in place or paralyze some of my movement. I don't want it to do that anymore, and so how can I keep it from continuing to do that? Oh.
So I was really interested, is this too close? Okay. In the triune brain, and I've seen that presented before.
Yeah.
But the age progression really got to me. And I started wondering about kids who are neurodivergent.
Yeah.
Do they follow the same pattern in terms of how their brain develops? And
Yeah.
is there places that it changes?
That's a really good question. I am not aware of that off the top of my head. I wouldn't be surprised at all if it kind of develops in maybe slightly different areas or different parts kind of spark up or light up before others, and others maybe are later too. But I don't actually know if that research has been done. If it is, though, I think that's a good thing to explore a little bit, because that's something else I really enjoy, kind of imagining various kind of research topics. Another fun little data point about the brain, I think neurologists were polled in the last 10 years or so, and they said, we know as much about the brain as Galileo knew about the universe. And so Galileo had this understanding, of course, maybe this is round, maybe we're orbiting around the sun. But his understanding of the entire cosmos was very limited at that point. Kind of similar with the brain right now. It has this really incredible spectrum of humiliatingly simple in some ways, and that's really how we engage with it most of the time, and then infinitely complex. And there's a lot, again, with that area of subjectivity. There's just so much about the brain that we still don't know, which gives me peace with all the AI stuff going on. I'm like, I just don't think we're quite there yet. We've got a half brain maybe. So, but yeah, that's a great question. I'm sorry I don't have more information about it though.
Oh, it is on. Okay, that caused me to want to ask a sort of a corollary to not only to that, but also to what you said before about something about what's changed and what's come around in psychology in the last 20 years or so.
Yeah.
And so I was a little curious because, for a while there, back when I was much younger, everybody was like, they were still, people older than me were still busy trying to go through psychoanalysis and all of that. Yeah. And I guess they don't do that anymore. Is that like, and
it's definitely still around. I actually really enjoy that part of it. It's not, I don't know that it has a ton of evidence base behind it, but a lot of what psychoanalysis is kind of this more interpretive and subjective engagement. There are so many different tools, I think, for engaging subjectivity, and I think psychoanalysis really seeks to offer kind of an interpretive understanding of development and say, okay, these are maybe some themes to pay attention to, or some stuff to be aware of, without necessarily saying, yes, we've got it, we've figured it out. And I think, again, the ways that we engage these things, sometimes they're very healthy, and we say, oh, okay, I have some ideas, some things to explore. And sometimes they can be a little bit kind of fundamentalist. This is the right and only way to do a thing. I would liken it somewhat to astrology or tarot readings. Those are extraordinarily informative, and they give us a lot of different things to consider. And I think when done well, it's like, oh, I can look at this and I can enhance my understanding. They don't, I think, often seek to say, and this is exactly what to expect, and this is you know what I mean? I think when it becomes that, it becomes less compelling for people, because it's, of course, easier to say, well, I don't think I see that happening, or whatever, where it's more of an exploration. It's like, these are things for me to consider and be aware of. They aren't necessarily these kind of solid factual experiences, though. And psychoanalysis does a really good job of dancing with subjectivity and interpretation, I think.
thank you.
Yeah.
So, about the fight or flight thing, if someone goes through a ton of situations where they would normally fight or flight, but they eventually just throughout their life, they realize that fighting the situation, whatever it is, or running away from it would be the worst thing they could do. So they realize that doing either of those would only hurt them more. Could that cause them to later in life start fighting or flighting at lesser scenarios, like situations where if they hadn't gone through that, their brain would process it normally, but then because they haven't been able to do this, their brain is telling them that this is a time when you should do this.
I want to make sure I understand your question correctly. So you're saying if somebody kind of experiences their fight or flight response so many times that they kind of stop allowing it to determine their actions, then later in life, there's going to be kind of like an expansion where they're going to experience even more of a fight or flight response. I think what it sounds like to me is oftentimes what happens and why people who experience trauma, if they don't address it, oftentimes do find themselves in counseling. And it's because typically when that fight or flight response is being activated a ton, you're experiencing a lot of toxic stress, and that reptilian brain is saying like, yes, I've got this, I've got this, I've got this. But as long as it goes unprocessed, what happens typically is the anxiety around the processing increases and increases and increases and increases, because every time we participate in an avoidant behavior, we actually reinforce and validate anxiety. And so a good example of this is COVID. We've all kind of gone through a pretty anxiety-heavy period as our species. And not only with that, but we were more or less separated from one another for 2 years, almost straight. And as soon as we started to lift some of the regulations and restrictions and people started coming back together, did anybody feel almost like a palpable sense of social anxiety? It was like you enter into a group area and it seemed like everybody was scared, myself included, where I'm looking and I'm like, I don't know these, I don't trust, like what's going on here? What's that? Yeah, that could be it too. And that wasn't because we all got less safe. It was because none of us were around each other for 2 years. And so our reptile brain got used to, oh, this must be what safety and security looks like. And if I am around people, I am not safe. And so with trauma, to get me back on track with your question, with trauma, if we're avoiding it, when I talk about anxiety, it's never static. It's either growing as a result of avoidance or it's decreasing as a result of exposure, and hopefully gradual exposure. There's something else. Growing as a result of avoidance. Oh, because yeah, every time you avoid something, that reptile brain says, see, I kept you safe because you didn't get hurt. You didn't go outside and you didn't get COVID and you didn't go into a group and you didn't get sick. Therefore, stay by yourself, stay in your house. That is where you are safe. And so that's kind of this interaction of avoidance and anxiety at the end of the day. Does that answer your question? Okay.
If I recognize a scenario in which my reptilian brain is likely to come out and play, something that is perceived to be dangerous, but is subjectively so, it's not objectively dangerous. If I have learned to recognize that, are there practices, are there ways that I can prepare myself beforehand to preemptively navigate my reptilian response? Can I get ready for it?
Yeah. And the fun thing is that you've already started to do that by thinking about it, because yes, there are actions that you can take, kind of preventative or preparatory actions, calming energy, exercises, any of those physical coping skills. I was sitting with my wife right before this started, and she was like, you should get up and walk around. And I was like, I should, I'm feeling very anxious. And so that helped a little bit. It didn't decrease it, but that was a little bit of a preventative activity. But what you're happening when you're thinking about it is you're actually kind of creating new neural pathways in your brain, which we didn't really talk about. But what neural pathways are kind of like if your brain goes from step A to B or A to Z enough times, it starts to carve out this pathway. And so we take stimuli A and we're at outcome Z. Or you can think of it as a sledding hill. First time you go down a sledding hill, it can be a little bit slow and ponderous. You go down it again, it gets faster. Maybe you try in a different place, but you usually end up kind of back at the same ending. And so over time, your brain can create these or carve out these very powerful neural pathways that say every time you speak in front of a crowd, you are very scared and they hate you or something like that. It's like, well, that's not necessarily the truth, but your brain is this pattern recognition machine that will go from point A to point Z very, very quickly the more you do it. As soon as you start to think about, well, how could I prevent this thing from happening? You're already starting to kind of create these new neural pathways. And so this kind of preparation for it is really valuable. What I would also recommend is talk about it out loud. Again, using that language part of the brain really kind of helps to develop these kind of like solid places for the brain to stand on and launch off of. If it just sits in that thoughts and feelings part, the brain has a much harder time holding on to it and saying, this is something that I can grow and develop.
Everything seems to come back to me in the end. But in my own circumstances of looking at the benefits of getting counseling, is there a particular point where, specifically addressing anxieties, the anxiety is brought on by conflict, say, a familial situation where you're having conflict with siblings. At what point during the counseling is there where you defer to your counselor for conflict resolution suggestions?
Yeah.
I don't know where that line is at.
Well, and I think what's fun about counseling, if you go back to that climbing wall example, it's really going to be up to each patient. And so if, let's say you have a long history of conflict with your siblings, and you say, we have tried and tried and tried and nothing has ever worked. Could you mediate for us? That could be you might be able to do it right away, first or second session. Say, I don't see any more ways of addressing this. And maybe there's an experience of, we've gotten close a few times, but every time I get distracted by something, or they bring up a resentment that they're carrying, and I get pulled down that path. In that instance, the counselor might say, well, be aware of that and maybe prepare beforehand. But it's really going to be different person to person. And so I think it's going to really depend on, your own personal experience with it, your sense of ability to handle it on your own. And if at the end of the day you'd say, I think I should have a mediator for this, counselors can be very helpful at that because, again, if we're doing our jobs well, we are not a part of the issue or a part of the conflict. We are sitting on the outside saying, well, here's what I see this person saying, and here's what I see that person saying, and here's what I see you not hearing from one another. And that can be really beneficial for mediating conflict.
Hi.
Hello.
I was wondering if you could touch on the development of the crocodile brain and the gut. Because I know I've experienced early on in my life not knowing what that was, the gut, hearing it growing up, what does your gut say?
Yeah.
That's Greek to me, and it still is.
Yeah.
Probably because of the environment or whatever was going on during that developmental stage of that part of the brain. I was wondering if you could touch on that.
Yeah. Again, I would say there's probably a lot more research and exploration that needs to be done with that. I have seen in the work that I've done, in the relationships that I have, people who have experienced challenging experiences in childhood can have either a really hyper, almost developed sense of their gut and their instinct. There's this kind of safety, security, where they're like, I am really sensitive to energies and to people that, you know, make me feel unsafe. Or there can also be this experience of like it kind of got shut down, and so I don't really understand what people say when they talk about their gut or their instincts. I would say I'm probably in your ballpark or your area where when I heard about people trusting guts or talking about energies, I was like, I also have autism, so I am very like as far as, and that's not to say that all people with autism can't, you know, have this experience. My experience of existence is much more objectivity heavy and centric, and so thinking about energies and guts, I'm like, this is like Greek to me. I don't understand Greek. Now, thankfully, my wife is on the opposite side. She is the subjectivity to my objectivity. And as I've been exposed to the way that she engages life and her ability to say, oh my God, the energy here, what she said, the energy here is wonderful. And so that is, and I can actually start to feel it more and more because she is consistently talking about these things and engaging these things. And so, I don't know a ton of facts about the interaction between, you know, the reptilian brain and gut, but yes, there is an element of your kind of safety sensing mechanism that I would guess correlates very strongly to people using this term gut, if that makes sense.
About not really about the brain or anything like that, but when you've been with a counselor for a number of years, do you think that you should switch to a different counselor if you've been with them for a number of years just to see a different light? Or would you stick with them for a little bit longer if another situation comes up?
Yeah, I would say that's going to change person to person. I personally think go through counselors as fast as you feel comfortable, because every counselor is going to have a slightly different approach. We are humans at the end of the day, and so my typical recommendation is if I'm seeing a client for a year or two and it doesn't feel like we've made a lot of progress, I will strongly recommend we either need to switch this up or you should go see somebody else, because for whatever reason I am not helping, I'm not supporting. And at the end of the day, your life is what matters, not my ego. And so if that means, yes, you know, I'm getting rid of my most enjoyable client in the week, it is much more important for their well-being that they feel like what they're doing in counseling is valuable at the end of the day. And so that can be challenging, though, because that rapport building part of counseling is hard. And you can see 10 different counselors and have 10 different levels of interest or excitement. They can all have different elements, like, oh, I really like this from this counselor or that from that counselor. But I will tell you, as a counselor, there is no shame in going through counselors. At the end of the day, this is your mental health and well-being, and if a counselor can't bear to lose a client, they have some work to do, I would say. And so, I don't know if that helps clarify anything, but defer to your own kind of sense of what you want from counseling and trust yourself with that decision, and you'll probably end up in a pretty positive place.
Okay. So a lot of the people I know and know about that have gone through severe childhood trauma, they explain that if they don't understand, for a lot of their life, especially teenagerhood, they didn't understand why they felt the way they did, why they felt like they had been treated terribly, because they didn't know why they felt that way. Their brains would often translate that into a creative, like a story, and they often imagine themselves as a central character, and that character had gone through some trauma that that their brains translated that would give them the same emotions that they were feeling, just from their perspective, gave them a reason to feel those things. And that can often cause, for any emotions you feel, if you're not understanding why you're feeling that, that story, the character will have a reason to feel like that. Yeah. And I'm just kind of wondering if there's any like evidence to support that or anything, because that's just what I've heard and observed.
Yeah. It actually sounds very similar to the evidence-based practice that we have for trauma experiences, especially for young people and adolescents, is called trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. And the key component of that is this creation of a trauma narrative. Now, the trauma narratives are typically based in writing down your actual experience, and then with the therapist, you would go over it over and over and over again, kind of filling out different details, emotions that you felt in the moment, emotions that developed after the fact. And this kind of, again, this increased exposure to the experience helps the brain to contextualize it. So this actually sounds pretty similar to that. And I wouldn't be surprised if that combined with, what was your name again? With Karen's experience where there are these blacked out experiences. I could see the marriage of those two things actually being very helpful, where it's like, well, I don't actually have the memory. Let me create something that my brain can reference that helps me contextualize this, if that makes sense. So yeah, I would think that would be easily related, because trauma narratives don't necessarily have to be these historical accounts. They definitely can be creative. Some people do them just with pictures anyways. And so writing a fictional story as a trauma narrative, I think would be a pretty effective way to process it. Can I steal the water? I am. I'm thirsty. Thank you.
I would like it if you could speak to therapy and addiction and
Yeah.
how they help each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm trying to think the best place to start here. I think the way I see addiction is addiction oftentimes develops out of wanting to escape a pain or a painful experience, painful memories. The thing that I talk about the most when it comes to addiction is, rather than just addiction around drug use, the thing that we typically associate with addiction, but kind of any compulsion or dependency. So behaviors that develop usually, again, as a way to avoid traumatic memories, as a way to avoid suffering, as a way to avoid even just discomfort. And so when I talk about people, or when I talk to people about addiction, sometimes, yes, our compulsive behavior of choice is I'm going to ingest a drug that helps me shut out all of these painful memories. And we all have compulsions that we engage. I think the most popular one that we have right now is our phones. And anytime we feel anxious or uncomfortable or nervous, well, I'll just pull out my phone and avoid that experience. And compulsions can be gambling, they can be sex, they can be video games, they can be eating, yes, they can be using opium, they can be, any number of things. All of these are kind of serving this same purpose, though, of let me avoid the discomfort of this. Could be, like you said, a traumatic memory or a painful experience. It could be just a nebulous, like, I don't know, this is a really painful existence, and I don't want to feel that pain anymore, and this is how I drown out that pain. And so that's kind of how addiction functions in a lot of ways. And of course, drugs are an extraordinarily effective way to do that, to mute that pain. But of course, with all these side effects that we don't want to have in our lives. And so, but yeah, that's my understanding of kind of addiction and avoidance and trauma. So. Oh, yes, sorry. So, and kind of similarly, what therapy is ideally doing is creating this environment where you feel safe to talk about that pain. You feel safe to start to process it, and you feel safe to develop alternative coping skills. Because at the end of the day, what addiction is it's a coping skill that has become a dependence or a compulsion. And so having a really diverse array of coping skills that you can engage is a way to prevent coping skills from becoming addictive or compulsions, if that makes sense. Video games can be a great coping skill, but also very, very powerful. They hijack our brains. I love video games, and I can lose myself in them. And so that's, for instance, a coping skill that can easily become a compulsion. And really, I mean, anything can, and that's why we want to have a bunch of different coping skills that we can use. Because if we're just relying on one, that can quickly become a dependence, if that makes sense. Oh, no problem. I think we're getting close to wrapping it up, so maybe it was a good timing.
This isn't a question, but I really appreciated when you talked about resilience, because I think we as a species are very, very resilient. And we need to really honor ourselves for, we've made it this far, everybody in this room has.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions?
I just want to say thank you. This has been so valuable to me. It's such a gift to our community. Thank you. I'm deeply grateful that you are doing this. This is sponsored by Youth and Family Ministry. Is it fair to ask if you were to offer just a high level, this is the best thing I have to say to parents or to people who care for our youth. Is it fair to ask for an elevator speech on what would that be? What's the best advice for those who care for our youngest people?
That's a good question. Let me think. Elevator speech. Well, I would say, okay, for parents, as a parent myself, I would say most likely you should probably not be as hard on yourself as you're being. I know that is something that I struggle with. It actually takes away a little bit from the experience of being a parent. I have so much anxiety, especially as a therapist, that my kids are not going to behave perfectly, or that they're not going to have lives without any suffering at the end of the day. It's what I want for my kids. And I also have to recognize that absent suffering, absent challenges, they are likely to experience a very muted experience of life. And so it's okay if they struggle. It's okay if they have mental health challenges. It's okay if they have a hard time, coalescing everything that we've learned in the last 5 years as a result of the internet and as a result of COVID. And these are every generation that follows has its new set of challenges that it has to overcome. And it's part of speaking to resilience. It's part of the beauty and the resilience of our species is that the next generation comes up and they are in a different world than even I grew up with. I'm not particularly aged, but I'm 35 now. And so when I look at people that are, in their teens and 20s, they have no idea how different their lives are than what I grew up with. And so kind of having a lot of grace and compassion for the ways that they're experiencing life. There's a lot more for them to overcome than I had to deal with in my very small and isolated adolescence. So I don't know, that's not really solid direction with that, but give yourselves a lot of grace and compassion if you're parents, and if you're kids too. Okay. Thank you.
There, okay. I want to just say, oh, whoa. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight, and particularly thank you for this amazing presentation. I know I learned so much, and we are looking to future presentations where it'll be, you alluded to a little bit, directing it specifically to teens or specifically to anxiety, and so your donations are appreciated to support this work. I think it's important, and we will be announcing as these come up. We're hopeful that we'll do a few of these a year. So thank you again, everyone, for attending.